Hey, hey, nice to see everybody. Okay, if there's one thing that I'm familiar with, that would be the Battle of Midway. This is perhaps, except for the Battle of Guadalcanal, which we will get to the week after next, this is probably the most intensely studied battle I have ever done, okay? So, with that said, if I can find the clicker, we can get on with this, because quite honestly, I've got a lot to cover, and this is really, really an intense battle, and what I'm going to talk to you today about is pretty much, to many of you, will be revisionist history. So I have a significantly different spin on this battle than what is traditionally taught. All right, we're going to start with the U.S. carrier fleet in the Pacific at that time, so we can understand how the different carrier fleets operated and what their pluses and minuses of each of their carriers were. All right, we have here two U.S. carriers, the Lexington and the Saratoga. They were originally to be built as battle cruisers. Remember, those are lightly armored battleships. But with the Washington Naval Agreement of 1921, we had too many battleships. So these ships were being built, and they decided while they were under construction to convert them to aircraft carriers. The reason was we had tonnage available under the new rules to build aircraft carriers, but no tonnage available to have any more battleships. So that's why these two things were converted. They're really big. They're 37,000-ton ships. And when they were built, they were the largest in the world. Now notice here, this little aircraft carrier, that's the USS Langley. That's our first aircraft carrier. So you can see the incredible size difference. Also notice, yes?
How far along were those ships when they decided to convert them?
The hulls were done.
Only the hull?
The hulls were done, yeah, and the hulls of the machinery was installed. So they were pretty far along. But they didn't have their, turrets and everything and their barbettes installed. So anyway, how do you tell these two ships apart if you're an aviator? They look exactly the same. Well, the Saratoga has a vertical stripe on its funnels, and the Lexington has a horizontal stripe. So when you're a pilot in the air, that's how you would tell those two ships apart. Okay, these were fast because they were meant to be battle cruisers. They have very large, powerful engines. They could go 33 knots, which is pretty darn fast for something that weighs 37,000 tons. And they also were equipped with only 2 elevators. So there's an elevator on each deck to bring planes up from below up onto the flight deck. They only had 2 of those. So they were rather slow and able to get big groups of planes in the air. At the time of the building, though, of course, little was known about the operation of aircraft carriers because aircraft carriers had only been invented a few years previously. So consequently, they thought, well, maybe airplanes aren't good enough to defend the ship. So they actually mounted 8-inch guns in multiple turrets, 4 turrets, 2 guns each. So they each had 8 guns of these 8-inch guns, which is the same kind of gun you would put on a heavy cruiser. So it was a kind of an anachronism of this type of ship that they would be built in such a manner. The other thing about this ship is the hangar deck. Okay, remember, you got a flight deck. That's where the planes take off of. And then below that is a thing called a hangar deck where you work on the airplanes and you load them up with bombs and repair them, etc. That is below. And that hangar deck was enclosed on this type of ship. Later U.S. ships, aircraft carriers, did not use that system. Okay. So here is one of those later aircraft carriers. These were very successful. This is the Yorktown class. We built 3 of these. They were 20,000 tons. They were relatively fast at 32 knots, a little slower, but not bad. But they carried a lot of aircraft. They carried 80 aircraft. So that's a bigger group even than the 37,000-ton Saratoga and Lexington. Their hangar deck is where there's a huge difference in these ships. The hangar deck on these ships is actually not enclosed. It's basically open and closed with like garage doors, rolling shutter doors. And you can see that. You can see through the ship. So the hangar deck on this aircraft carrier is actually open, and that comes to be a really good thing because you can warm up airplanes below deck. You can start their engines and get their engines fired up. And the other thing about it is if you have a bomb hits that ship and there's airplanes and bombs and stuff laying around on that hangar deck, you can just kind of shove it over the side. And also it doesn't contain gases. So if you have fumes from aviation fuel, etc., that all can be vented. So that greatly aids their survivability. They are very durable. Like I said, they can sustain a large amount of damage, and also they have redundant fire suppression systems. Another thing they can do that most carriers cannot do is they can drain their fuel lines and replace their fuel lines with an inert gas. So basically, they're much harder to catch on fire. All right, let's look at a Japanese carrier. This is the Hiryu. It's really fast. It's like a Greyhound of aircraft carriers. It can go 34 knots. It has a decent amount of aircraft with 64 and 9 spares. And what they would do in Japanese ships is they would store partially assembled aircraft overhead in the flight deck, or excuse me, in the hangar deck. So they would have 9 spare aircraft on top of their 64. They had 3 elevators, so they can get their planes up on deck quickly, but they have absolutely no armor, so they're lightly built. They incorporated also, another problem is they incorporated their fuel tanks, their aviation fuel tanks, into the hull itself. So if they sustain damage, those tanks have a tendency of rupturing. And when those tanks rupture, of course, they leak fuel and fumes. Also, Japanese have another issue with their carriers is they use multiple hangar decks. So unlike a US carrier that has one hangar deck below the flight deck, the Japanese carriers have 2 hangar decks below. The reason is that they do that is all their arming and all their fueling are done in the hangar decks. They do not arm and fuel airplanes on the flight deck. The US does do that. So we have a significant amount of difference in the doctrine between these 2 carriers just in the way they operate their air groups. All right, the best aircraft carriers the Japanese made, particularly at this time, were these 2, and that's the Shokaku and Zuikaku. And in my opinion, these are definitely the world's finest aircraft carriers when they were built in 1941. And they really we don't come up with an aircraft carrier that's nearly as good as these 2 until the Essex class becomes available in late 1943. So these carriers are well ahead of their time. The Shokaku and Zuikaku could carry 72 aircraft plus 12 spares. They were capable of 34 knots, so they're very, very fast. And they have an armored deck. So they have their flight deck, they have a hangar deck, and that first hangar deck is heavily armored, 5 to 6.5 inches of armor plating. So they're pretty survivable, and unlike other Japanese carriers at this time, they do have redundant capability for fire extinguishing. But typical of their other Japanese carriers, they had 3 elevators, so they can get their planes up from their 2 hangar decks relatively quickly. And again, because they're enclosed, these ships cannot warm up aircraft below deck. They have to warm them up on the deck. So, what about doctrine? The overall carrier doctrine. We talked a little bit about this in the Pearl Harbor class. The first is that the Japanese are capable of launching massive strikes from multiple carriers. So basically, they will put all their carriers in one basket and get their planes up in the air under the control of one commander. So they have trained on this for years. And again, they're the only Navy in the world that has this capability at this time. They operate in visual range of each other. So they don't operate far apart. They stay really close together. And the reason for that is they don't really want to use radios. They don't have the radio technology to use a short-range radio. We do. So they actually stay within visual range of each other. And the other thing they do is they have their escort ships widely spaced around the carriers. So they're pretty far away. And the idea of that is that the escort ships will see incoming planes and will fire a barrage of AAA, and AAA, just in case you were unaware, means anti-aircraft artillery. They will fire that barrage, and that will draw the attention of the Combat Air Patrol fighters, CAP, and they will go towards that direction to go attack the incoming enemy. These ships do not have radar. So they've got two big issues. They don't have radar, and they have to keep their ships widely spaced. And also another thing is they have very, very limited training on damage control. By the end of war, the U.S. Navy made sure that every single sailor on a U.S. ship had had damage control training. The Japanese do not put a lot of effort into this. So that's a major, major problem. So looking at them, you can see that the Japanese carriers, just by the fact they don't have radar, they don't have ability to communicate with their aircraft that are flying combat air patrol because they don't have a combat information center, a CIC, they are very, very vulnerable to attack. Well, let's look at the U.S. So U.S. carriers are, as I said in the previous class, are meant to be the eyes of the fleet. They operate independently. Usually one aircraft carrier is assigned to a group of battleships to be its scouting force and perhaps inflict some damage. Perhaps they could make a small pinprick raid on a coastal facility or a port, but they're not used in a big, massive formation. Carriers generally acted alone, like I said, but they were able to communicate with very high-frequency radio, which we refer to as TBS, which is talk between ships. So they didn't need to be in visual range of each other all the time. And in fact, standard practice early in the war was for our carriers to be about 20 or 30 miles apart. So if you had the carriers theoretically in a task group, they wouldn't be like right next to each other. They'd be 20, 30 miles apart. Well, what that means too, though, is when they launch airstrikes, those airstrikes are not coordinated as one big grouping. They launch airstrikes as individual carriers. We did have early version of radar by this time on our carriers. It was unable to tell how high or how low an attacking force was. It could only tell you the range, but it couldn't tell you the altitude. That's a problem because then you don't know where to stack your fighters, your combat air patrol. Do you put them all high? Do you put them medium? Do you put them low? So what they would end up doing is they'd end up putting their combat air patrol at 3 different levels, usually. But if the planes all came in high, then the other guys are too low. So you can see there would obviously be a problem with that. They have a very limited capability of combat information center. And the reason this kind of is a failure is because of poor radio discipline by the people in the fighter planes, the combat air patrol guys. They'd all be on the radio chattering about about, well, watch out, Joe, there's a fighter on your tail and stuff like that. So they didn't have really good discipline. Well, they're all on the same frequency. They're all on the same channel. So the guy that's running the Combat Information Center can't get information out to everybody because everybody's always talking. So it really becomes a problem. Another thing, though, that's vastly different, because we have radar, our escort ships stay very, very close to our carriers. So consequently, when Japanese planes do attack, they can help with the anti-aircraft defense of those carriers. Japanese do not have that capability. All right, let's talk about our planes. Remember we talked about the Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor. So we'll talk about the Wildcat. That was our primary fighter at the time. It's a little slower than a Zero at 318 miles an hour. There's 2 different models that are used, an F4F3 and an F4F4. This is an F4F3. The difference of those 2 fighters is, pretty simply, that the 4 has the capability to fold its wings so it can be more compactly stored on an aircraft carrier. The other thing about a 4, instead of having 4 machine guns, 2 in each wing, It has 6 machine guns, but it only has the same amount of ammunition. So consequently, you tend to run out of ammunition quite a bit faster flying a 4. Also, it's heavier because of the folding wings and other things that have been added to it. And the reason they went from 4 guns to 6 was because the British demanded that, because the British were also going to use this plane. So the British said, well, look, we normally have 8 guns on a fighter. We need to have at least 6 on this one. And the U.S. pilots were very, very unhappy about this. They did not want this because it adds weight and it reduces the time you can shoot the guns. So consequently, they felt it made the plane less effective. The comment was that if you couldn't hit something with 4 guns, you probably couldn't hit it with 8 either. So they weren't really particularly very happy about this. The other thing about this aircraft that really makes it incredible is it's very, very sturdy. And Grumman, who produced this aircraft and produced naval aircraft for the United States into the 90s, was known as Grumman Iron Works because of the quality of the durability of these aircraft. So let's talk about that. This is a quote from Saburo Sakai, who's one of the top Japanese aces of World War II, and it's from the book called Zero. And here's Sakai's comments. I had full confidence in my ability to destroy the Grumman and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only my rifle caliber 7.7 millimeter machine guns and turned off my 20 millimeter cannons. For some strange reason, even after I had poured about 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman, the airplane didn't fall but kept on flying. I thought, this is very odd. It had never happened before, and closed the distance between the 2 airplanes until I could almost reach out and touch the Grumman. To my surprise, the Grumman's rudder and tail were torn to shreds, looked like an old torn piece of rag. With this plane in such a condition, no wonder the pilot was unable to continue fighting. A Zero, which had taken that many bullets, would have been a ball of fire by now. So you can see this airplane is incredibly durable. Another thing that would happen, and Sakai was actually very smart, because he came in and he fired all his shots into this airplane, but he stayed behind it. What would frequently happen is Japanese fighter pilots would get on the tail of an F-4F and shoot the heck out of it, right? And thinking, well, that plane's obviously destroyed, and then they would zoom up in front of it to gain altitude. Well, unfortunately, when they zoomed up in front of it, guess what they were? They were a perfect target for that Grumman, and that Grumman made them pay for it. And they would be a ball of fire. And that happened numerous times. So there's something to be said about rugged. All right, we'll talk about this plane, which it was really good when it was first made, but by the time World War II rolls around, it's quite obsolete. This is the Devastator. This is our standard torpedo bomber. It's underpowered. It's heavy. It's slow. 208 miles an hour. Yes? A twin Wasp engine is a radial engine, air-cooled radial engine that's 2 engines sandwiched together. So basically, I think that one was 16 cylinders, I believe. So they took 2 8-cylinder engines and mated them together. That's how that worked. It was slow, like I said, maximum speed was 208. That's without a torpedo. And it had a 3-man crew, but when they were carrying a torpedo, one guy had to stay home because they couldn't afford the weight. So the plane needed to be only two people in the plane because they couldn't carry the torpedo and another guy. And when launching a torpedo, it only had a maximum speed of 100 miles an hour. So it's pretty obsolete. Now we're talking about my personal favorite plane of all time. And that is the SBD-2 or 3 that both served at this battle, Douglas Dauntless. The Douglas Dauntless is a dive bomber. Remember, a dive bomber comes swooping down and drops its bomb close to the target and then swoops back up. So it's highly accurate. It's sturdy. It's able to carry a 1,000-pound bomb. It's got a decent range. And this aircraft is responsible for virtually every single U.S. victory in the early part of the war. It's a tremendous aircraft. And if you notice, you can see these little holes here. This thing has dive brakes on it. So basically, when you're going to go into a dive bombing attack, you pop these brakes open, and it slows the aircraft down and makes it steadier. And it also lets you go slower, so when you get down to a low altitude to drop your bomb, you then can pull out. You don't crash into the ocean. So it's really, really an excellent little plane. And again, very, very effective. All right. The Japanese plan for the second phase. Now, we've talked about the fact that the war is going just really well for Japan. They are doing great. I mean, things couldn't be better. In fact, they've achieved every single goal they had. And now they're thinking, well, what do we do next? Well, let's see. We could invade Australia. We could isolate Australia. Maybe we should capture Hawaii. Or maybe we should destroy the U.S. fleet. But we got to do something because the U.S. hasn't declared peace yet, and we need to get them to say, hey, you know what, we give up on the war, you know, you can have Asia, you know, just leave us alone. And that's really their goal. So consequently, they don't really know what they want to do. Well, the Japanese Navy says, you know what, we need to invade Australia. And the Japanese Army says, no, we can't invade Australia. We don't have 10 divisions to spare. And by the way, we don't have enough ships to support 10 divisions in Australia anyway, cargo ships. So the Army says, no, we're not going to do that. Well, the Navy then says, well, maybe what we should do is we should isolate Australia and take part of New Guinea and Fiji and all these islands and make a blockade of Australia. And they kind of agreed to doing that. Well, Admiral Yamamoto says, no, we don't want to do that. We need to destroy the U.S. fleet, because if we destroy the U.S. fleet, everything else happens automatically. So he wants to destroy the U.S. fleet and attack Hawaii. Basically, in 1943, the plan is actually to invade Hawaii. Kind of a pipe dream, but that was the thought. So the Navy says, no, we don't want to do that. And once again, Yamamoto says, well, if I can't get my way, I'll resign. And they cave in and say, okay, we're going to do both. We're going to try to isolate Australia, and we're going to try to destroy the U.S. fleet. This is commonly known in historian land as victory disease. The Japanese are now biting off way more than they could possibly chew. They don't have the capability to do both these things. So, they start with trying to take part of New Guinea, and they are going to take the town of Lae and Salamaua right there. Well, unfortunately, U.S. code breakers have figured this out, and they know that the Japanese are intending to do this. So Nimitz decides, Admiral Nimitz decides that he's going to send the Lexington and the Yorktown down to New Guinea area to intervene in this. And on the morning of the 10th, they launch a strike from the Gulf of Papua over the Owen Stanley Mountains to attack Lae and Salamaua. Now, why would you do that? Why would you go over the mountains to do that? Well, the simple answer is they were afraid of Rabaul, where the Japanese had significant amount of land-based naval air capability. So they thought, well, if we come in from the other side of the mountains, first of all, we don't have to worry about that, and second of all, it's going to be a heck of a big surprise. Well, they actually do that. They attack over the mountains. And remember that TBD, the Devastator torpedo bomber? Well, when it's carrying a torpedo, it has a little bit of trouble getting over the mountains. So they actually have to fly parallel to the mountains for a while until they get an updraft, and then the updraft actually lifts those torpedo bombers over the mountain. So again, it's a very limited aircraft. But this attack is extremely successful. They destroy 3 transports and a minesweeper, and 7 other ships, Japanese ships, are damaged. And what it basically does is it causes the Japanese to realize that they don't have enough air cover to attack Port Moresby. That's right there, because they need to eventually attack Port Moresby to take over all of New Guinea. So consequently, that puts a monkey wrench in their plans, and now they have to say, hey, you know what, we're going to need some help to do this. We need a couple of aircraft carriers. Well, the Japanese say, okay, we're going to give you a couple of fleet carriers, and we're also going to give you a brand new light carrier called the Shoho. And the deal here is that they're going to detach the Shokaku and Zuikaku from Kido Butai and send them down here to help with this invasion. And what that plan is then they will return after the invasion and join Kido Butai to attack Midway Island. That's the plan. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out that way. So the Shoho is to protect the troop transports. It's basically to provide fighter support. The Shokaku and Zuikaku are designed to attack the coast of Australia because the Japanese are very concerned about land-based intervention on this attack. So basically, they're going to send the two fleet carriers to tie down the coast of Australia, basically launch airstrikes on land bases, while the invasion fleet comes up from the north and gets into Port Moresby. That's the idea. Well, once again, Allied intelligence breaks their codes, and we know what's going on pretty well. Not exactly, but have a good idea. And Nimitz plans to send two carriers to basically bust up this Japanese plan. And he puts together a large cruiser force between U.S. and Australian cruisers to also help with this defense. All right, so on May 3rd, the Japanese invade the island of Tulagi. That's here. And they're unopposed. The Australians have withdrawn and only leave coast watchers behind. And it's going pretty smoothly for the Japanese. But then the Yorktown launches an attack on the Japanese shipping at Tulagi. And they do some damage. They sink a destroyer. By the way, that destroyer hull can still be seen off the island of Tulagi if you are so inclined to go to Tulagi. It's still sitting there. And they sink some minesweepers and they damage a bunch of other stuff. But unknown to the Yorktown, the Japanese Cruiser Division 5 is over here. While the Cruiser Division 5 starts looking for the Yorktown. They think the Yorktown is east of Tulagi. In fact, the Yorktown is south of Tulagi, and they never do see it. So then Fletcher is informed by Pearl Harbor and the code breakers that the Port Moresby invasion is scheduled for the 10th, May 10th. And he assigns a task force from the Yorktown and Lexington to guard the Coral Sea, and he sends the cruisers off to guard the Jomard Pass. So that's where the cruisers are. So he separates into two separate groups. What he's not aware of, though, is that the Japanese Carrier Division 5 is actually east of him. It's actually behind him. He has no idea of that. Well, on May 6th, the B-17s from Port Moresby spot the invasion force. That's the one that's coming towards the Jomard Pass. And Fletcher thinks that must be where the main Japanese carrier force is. He thinks, well, it's got to be there because they're with the transports protecting them. He's still totally unaware that the Japanese are not where he thinks they are, the main carrier force. And he refuels his carriers, and he sends the fueler, the oiler, Neosho, and an escort destroyer down to the south. He says, okay, we're going to shoot north, and we're going to attack the Japanese. Well, so both carrier groups are now looking for each other. And this is kind of a confused battle, to say the least. And the Japanese think that Fletcher is south of them, and Fletcher believes that the Japanese are north of them. Well, the fact of the matter is it's the opposite. The Japanese are actually south of Fletcher, and the Fletcher is actually north of the Japanese. So they're both looking completely in the wrong direction. Well, what happens, though, is the Japanese looking south, what do they find? They get a report, hey, there's an aircraft carrier and a cruiser down south. So they decide to launch a major strike. What they actually have launched a strike at is the oiler Neosho and the little destroyer Sims. So this strike easily destroys both of them, but they haven't damaged any carriers. Then, SBD, one of my Dauntlesses, sights the covering force and misinforms Fletcher that indeed there's two carriers there. So now Fletcher is absolutely convinced that the Japanese main force is coming down with the transports. And he launches 93 aircraft. Well, indeed, 93 aircraft are more than little Shoho can handle. And you can see little Shoho taking a torpedo hit and on fire here. She's just totally overmatched. Just a very small carrier. And the famous line goes out from the U.S. attacking force, scratch one flat top. So indeed, the Shoho is destroyed. Well, May 8th rolls around, and they're still looking for each other. They can't find each other. But then that morning, 2 minutes apart, the Japanese discover the U.S. and the U.S. discovers the Japanese. And they both launch major strikes. The Japanese launch 18 fighters, 33 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo planes. The U.S. in two separate groups, because they don't operate together, launches 39 dive bombers, 21 fighters, 21 torpedo planes, and 15 fighters. That's the total of the two groups. It's not two groups that big. Well, the Japanese take the brunt of it first because the U.S. gets a little bit ahead of the Japanese, and they hit the Shokaku with 3 1,000-pound bombs. The Zuikaku is in a rain squall and is unobserved, so she gets away unscathed. And all the torpedo planes, I know this is a shock, they all miss. The Shokaku's flight deck is inoperable, and she retires from the battle. The Japanese response hits the Lexington. They hit that with 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes, and you can see where those hit in this picture. The Yorktown is also hit by a 250-pound bomb and is severely damaged. So both U.S. carriers, though, are operable. So they can steam, and they're doing okay. The Lexington is surprisingly doing well, but unfortunately, one of the torpedoes has ruptured a fuel tank. The Lexington, with an enclosed hull, begins to fill with fumes from this fuel, and a spark ignites it, and the Lexington basically explodes. We can see here, there's a picture on the left of the Lexington sinking. It is heavily on fire. Its ordnance in its hangar deck is cooking off, and there's more and more explosions, and finally the Lexington succumbs. It's our first fleet carrier loss of the war. As you can see on the right, that's the bow of the Shokaku that's been hit by one of our 1,000-pound bombs. It's heavily damaged and is certainly out of the fight. So what's the result of the Battle of Coral Sea? Simply enough, it's a tactical victory for the Japanese because they've traded a little light carrier for a big fleet carrier. And we also have lost a destroyer, and we've lost an oiler. And oilers are actually quite important. But the Japanese now do not have air power to take care of, control the airspace over their invasion force from land-based Australian and U.S. forces. So they now realize that they can't invade Port Moresby, and they turn around and go back. So it's a strategic victory for the Allies because, quite honestly, they can't invade Port Moresby. The key thing, though, in regards to the Battle of Midway is that the Shokaku is heavily damaged and the Zuikaku's air groups are badly depleted. So indeed, this will have intense issues for the Japanese in the forthcoming battle. And with that said, I want you all to take a nice short break. Well, here we go. I wanted to give this lecture for a long time. Yamamoto and the Midway Plan. How do I describe this as a plan? I think the word I used is Byzantine. Perhaps one of the most ill-conceived battle plans of all time. Well, why is that the case? Well, first of all, the Japanese believe that they will have to force the U.S. Navy to come out and fight them. They believe that they have sunk the Lexington, which they did. They believe they have sunk the Yorktown, which they did not. They believe that a submarine has sunk the Saratoga, which it did not, but it did damage it enough where it had to go back to the United States to be repaired. But they assume, always a bad word, that there's only 2 carriers and they have to find some way to make the United States fleet come out and fight them because they think that they won't do it. Well, the first thought is, well, we could directly attack Hawaii, but Hawaii is a bit of a tougher nut to crack. And quite honestly, my opinion is that even had the Japanese won the Battle of Midway, they could never have taken Hawaii. Hawaii had basically over 100,000 U.S. soldiers on it. The Japanese do not have the capability to launch attacks on an island like we did later in the war. So they realized pretty much that that's not going to happen. So what they do decide, though, is they can attack Midway Island. Midway Island is 1,300 miles west of Hawaii. If they control Midway Island, it will certainly be a problem for the United States because it will, again, have extended their perimeter, and it's very close to Hawaii at 1,300 miles. So the last thing we want is the Japanese to have a land base that close to Pearl Harbor. And the other good thing about it, it's beyond the effective range of our long-range bombers. Even B-17s can't fly out 1,300 miles in one direction, drop bombs, and come back 1,300 miles. It's too far. They don't have that ability. And so Yamamoto is positive that this will be the way to get the U.S. fleet out to fight, because that's what he wants to do. He wants to destroy the U.S. fleet. So what he decides to do is to trick the United States. Hey, I'm going to fool these guys. I'm going to disperse my forces all over the place. And then they'll see one force, but they won't know that there's other forces trailing behind, lurking. And the other plan is that once he knocks out Midway, he will have taken away our ability to do reconnaissance. And he feels that this is certainly will be the way to get our fleet to come out, and then his big surface force, he's bringing out all his battleships, all his cruisers, everything he has, is going to come in and smash the U.S. fleet. Well, what the plan is they're going to use Kido Butai to knock out the island. He's going to leave one light carrier to cover the invasion force. He's going to put a screen of submarines between Midway and Hawaii. So that screen of submarines will see when the U.S. fleet comes out of Hawaii. They will not be able to report back, and perhaps they'll get lucky and sink a ship or two. And then finally, the Japanese battleships, when the U.S. fleet comes out, will rush in, unknown to the U.S., and crush the U.S. fleet. Of course, the battleships are too slow to be with Kido Butai because Kido Butai's average speed is about 29 knots. And of course, the battleships, even the Japanese battleships, which are faster than ours, I think their fastest one is like 27 knots. So they can't really fight with Kido Butai. And again, he's come up with this plan where he's got all these fleets separated. They're not all one big mass of ships. They're all over the place. They also intend to have another thing, is they're going to use a thing called French frigate shoal. Now, French Frigate Shoal is between Midway and between Pearl Harbor. And they're going to put a submarine in French Frigate Shoal full of aviation gas. And they're going to land seaplanes. The submarine will refuel the seaplanes, and then the seaplanes will go on to Pearl Harbor and reconnoiter where the U.S. fleet is. So like the submarine screen, this is another way to get reconnaissance. Well, the problem with this plan is you've got all these things going on. They're not self-supporting because they're all hundreds of miles away. It requires incredibly precise timing, and because you have radio blackout, none of these groups can communicate with each other. So everything depends on the U.S. doing exactly what the Japanese want them to do. Well, as we saw at Pearl Harbor, when we made that mistake, unfortunately, you never should do that. What you should do is what the enemy is capable, not what you think they will do. Whenever you put yourself in this position, you open yourself up for a failure. And indeed, that's what they do. They've come up with this weird, disjointed plan that's totally based on the notion that the U.S. fleet is basically afraid of the Japanese. Well, we're not that afraid because we, yes, Ellen.
On that previous slide,
Yes, ma'am.
could you outline what is land on the Midway? I can't tell what that
Oh, that's the land. That's the land. There's two little islands. This is a coral reef. And that's the channel into the lagoon. They're tiny. They don't even have anything. Nobody lives there. Okay, it's not like, it's just an airstrip. It's the, in quote, unsinkable aircraft carrier. So I assume everybody heard that. How much land was there on Midway? And the fact of the matter is not very much. It's tiny. Okay. All right, well, I keep talking about these code breakers. You know, we break the code here, we break the code there. And what would happen is countries would exchange naval officers to learn the language and, you know, do a little casual spying and get an idea of what your opponent's like. And key people were there. For example, Admiral Yamamoto was one of these people. He went to school in the United States. He was a military liaison in the United States. And two guys from the U.S. that did the same thing are Eddie Layton and this guy, Joe Rochefort. They serve together actually in Japan. That's where they meet. And they create this incredible partnership. Rochefort is a brilliant code breaker and really a smart guy. And Layton has an ability to take information from multiple sources and put it into a package and present it to Admiral Nimitz. And by 1942, by this time, they can break a good percentage of the main Japanese naval code, which is JN25B. So that, and with radio direction finding, remember I talked about a guy's fist, they have a pretty good idea of what the Japanese are doing. Well, Rochefort, how would I put this? He's a nutball. I mean, really, he's kind of a wacky character. He never comes out of his bunker hardly. He's wearing a smoking jacket and a pair of slippers around he's just not very Navy. And quite honestly, the Navy doesn't really think too much of them, particularly the guys in Washington. They think, oh man, this guy's like, he's not fitting in, okay? But the fact of the matter is, he's brilliant. Well, Rochefort and Layton are convinced that the next major Japanese attack will be at Midway. And it will be late May, early June. But Op-20G, that's our main headquarters for code breaking in Washington, says, no, you guys are wrong. What's going to happen is the Japanese are going to make an attempt to attack the West Coast. And there's two guys there that are known as the Redmond brothers. One is the admiral in charge of Op-20G, and his other one is his brother, has a major position there. They are convinced that people in Hawaii, Rochefort and Layton, are completely wrong. Well, this guy, Jasper Holmes, comes up with an idea. He goes, you know, the Japanese are constantly talking about attacking AF, but we don't really know what AF is. We need to find that out. Well, there's an underwater cable, telephone cable, that leads to Midway from Hawaii. And they tell the people on Midway, you know what we want you to do? We want you to broadcast in the clear an uncoded message that the desalinization plant on Midway is broken and you're short of water. Ellen, to your point, Midway is so small it does not even have its own source of water. They have to use a desalinization plant to make fresh water. So they do this, and Midway broadcasts this message in the clear. And the very next day, the Japanese broadcast, AF is short of water. So now they know that AF is Midway. Well, Rochefort and his team, they figured this out. Well, this just really aggravates the Redmond brothers. They're embarrassed because they were wrong and they've been making a big deal out of this. And these guys, I mean, it's just shameful. They ruin Joe Rochefort's career. They basically, after the Battle of Midway, take him out of the battle area, take him away from what his position is as a code breaker, and put him in charge of a floating dry dock on the West Coast. Not the best use of a talent. And he gets no credit whatsoever for this achievement. He doesn't get a medal or anything until, I believe, after his death. He's finally recognized for the fact that he is one of the main people that caused the defeat of the Japanese at Midway. So it's really just shameful how he was treated. Well, now Nimitz has this information. He's like, okay, I got to come up with a plan because now I know they're going to attack Midway. And he starts sending everything he has to Midway to beef up its defenses. He sends a Marine Defense Battalion and 126 aircraft. Yes, some of these are obsolete, but he literally scrapes up everything he has. Of course, it's going to feature that lovely Brewster Buffalo is on its way to Midway. Well, the lack of carriers is Nimitz's main problem. He has two that are ready to go. He's got Enterprise and Hornet, but he doesn't have the third one because the Yorktown is damaged, the Lexington has been sunk, and of course the Saratoga is in California. But they take the Yorktown into dry dock, and they spend 3 days working night and day trying to repair the ship as best as possible. In fact, when the ship does sail, it actually has construction people still on board working on it. He also does another thing. The Saratoga's air group, a good percentage of it, has been left behind at Pearl Harbor. In order to replace the losses from Coral Sea, they transfer those pilots and planes onto the Yorktown. So now the Yorktown has a full group of aircraft to fight the Japanese. He's got another problem. His main carrier admiral, Admiral Halsey, has a tremendous case of dermatitis, so bad that he is hospitalized. And now he puts Raymond Spruance, who is a cruiser admiral, never been in charge of an aircraft carrier, in charge of 2 of his fleet carriers. And he sends him out to a place aptly named Point Luck. Point Luck is northeast of Midway, and they lie in wait for the Japanese. Well, the Japanese Midway plan is unraveling from the very beginning. The Kido Butai, the main strike force, is not nearly what it used to be at Pearl Harbor. The Shokaku is heavily damaged, Zuikaku has sustained severe losses to their air groups, and unlike the U.S., the Japanese never ever consider taking the remnants of the air group from Shokaku and putting them on Zuikaku and sending Zuikaku out with Kido Butai, because that's not their doctrine. It's totally common for U.S. air groups to jump from carrier to carrier. In Japan, they never do that. An air group stays with its carrier regardless. So consequently, because of their doctrine, they leave a perfectly good aircraft carrier behind that they certainly could have used. All right, Kido Butai itself is worn out from 6 months of continuous operation. And they're running out of airplanes, which sounds amazing, but they literally don't have enough airplanes available to restock Kido Butai because they've got so many things going on at one time. They're stretched to the max. And really, probably more incredibly, they only make, in the entire year of 1942, 56 carrier-based bombers and torpedo planes. Now, if you think about U.S. production, that's just incredible, that you would only make 56 planes in a year. But they're changing over to newer models. So consequently, they've decided, well, we'll just shut down the line and retool the line for these new planes. So basically, going into a major world war, they're not building carrier-based bombers. Also, the recon plan is a total failure. The submarines show up late. So by the time the submarines get into position to spot the U.S. fleet, the U.S. fleet's already passed them. It's gone east of them. And it's on its way to Point Luck. So the Japanese, that fails. The U.S. decides to put a group of destroyers at French frigate shoals. So they can't use French frigate shoals to spot the recon planes, this flying boat right here, which have been what they would have used. And so consequently, that plan goes out the window. So all the Japanese reconnaissance thought process is gone. All right. I've titled this slide, No Miracle at Midway. For those of you that perhaps have read two of the biggest books about this battle, one is called Miracle at Midway by Gordon Prang. The other one is called Incredible Victory by Walter Lord. Some of you may have read these books. They were very popular. They both make the point that a plucky little U.S. fleet, vastly outnumbered by a gigantic force of Japanese, managed to pull victory from the jaws of defeat with just, pure American know-how, I guess would be the best way to put it. Well, unfortunately, when you really look at the key parts of this battle, that doesn't really hold up. Because we look at Kido Butai, they had 227 organic aircraft, and they were carrying 21 additional Zeros to be stationed at Midway after they captured it. Well, the U.S. has 126 land-based aircraft and 233 carrier-based aircraft at Midway. So basically, it's 248 Japanese to 359 U.S. Now you say, well, they got 4 carriers, and we only had 3. Yeah, but they've got Midway Island, which is an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's not going anywhere. If you don't take it, it's still there. So consequently, there's not really this whole thought process that Midway was like some miracle victory by the United States. The things that really mattered in this battle, we actually had an advantage. And if we look at this, we see roughly, we see roughly where the invasion fleets were spread all over the place. So the Japanese have not concentrated their forces. They've got this weird, like I said, Byzantine plan. None of these forces can communicate. None of these forces are supporting each other. So where the battle actually matters, at Point Luck, the Japanese are actually at a pretty good-sized disadvantage. Again, the Japanese have no knowledge of where our carriers are, so they're coming in blind. On June 3rd, a Catalina, that's a flying boat, I'll show you a picture in a minute, spots the Japanese invasion group, not Kido Butai. And Rochefort and Layton now know for sure that they have predicted exactly what the Japanese are, that the force of those transports is just where they predict they would be at that date. So they know they've got the Japanese in a bad spot. Of course, the long-range bombers, there are B-17s on Midway, begin to attack the invasion force. They don't really cause much damage, but they do start, and that's on the night of June 3rd. All right, here's that Catalina I was telling you about. It's a really tremendous aircraft. For example, this is the aircraft that found the Bismarck for the British. It's a U.S. aircraft, and had a U.S. pilot that found the Bismarck, but that's another story. So the Kido Butai is 200 miles northwest of Midway, and they launch at 4:30 in the morning, a strike of 108 aircraft. They also put out a weak reconnaissance force because they really think that the U.S. Navy is back at Pearl Harbor. They think that the U.S. Navy has no idea that they're attacking Midway. A PBY spots the incoming Japanese force of 108 aircraft, tells Midway, you need to get all your planes off the ground right away. The Midway does that. All their bombers, all their fighters launch, and 26 Marine fighters, including the Buffaloes, are engaged by 36 Zeros, and unfortunately the Marines lose 15 aircraft, and the ones that do manage to survive are so badly shot up that only 2 of them were serviceable by the end of that melee in the air. The Japanese bombing is pretty good. There are actually films of this. You can find them on YouTube. But they're not good enough. And the commander of the Japanese strike says, you know what, we need a second strike to knock out the air base at Midway. And then a PBY spots Kido Butai, and the bombers from Midway, because remember, they're already up in the air, and they're armed, begin to make a stream of uncoordinated attacks on Kido Butai. And this becomes critical. 710 and 820, 4 different groups of those bombers reach Kido Butai and launch attacks. They don't score any hits, but the Japanese carriers are continuously busy launching and recovering CAP fighters, combat air patrol. So that consequently, the Japanese really can't get themselves organized. Well, at 7:15, Nagumo has heard from his strike commander that they need to have another strike on Midway. So he begins to he's got half of his planes set up to attack ships, and the other half are in the air attacking Midway. He takes all the weapons, the torpedoes and ship-killing bombs off of those planes and has them switched over to land attack weapons. Then, while that process is going on, at 8 o'clock, one of his few reconnaissance aircraft spots the U.S. carriers. And now he knows he's in trouble. So he's got a dilemma. What does he do? He orders that the torpedoes be put back on the aircraft. So instead of properly storing all this ordnance, it's now littering the decks, not the flight deck, but the hangar decks of his aircraft carriers. And his other people, his other command group says, you know, maybe we should just launch a strike right now. Because quite honestly, we don't have time to change everything over and do everything the proper manner. We should probably just launch a strike with whatever we've got. And Nagumo says, no, because that's not our doctrine. Our doctrine is to launch big, coordinated, unified attacks. And then Nagumo decides he's going to land the Midway strike force first. Well, in many versions of this story, this becomes the critical issue that Nagumo has delayed his strike force, that Nagumo has, decided to land and have a coordinated attack and all this stuff. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's after 8 o'clock. The U.S. carriers have already launched. So guess what? None of that mattered. Maybe he would have damaged some more Japanese ships, maybe not. But the fact of the matter is, when the outcome of this battle has already been decided because the U.S. carriers have launched their strike before 8 a.m. So the 3 carriers, again, the U.S. tactics are very, very primitive compared to the Japanese, launch uncoordinated strikes. One carrier launches, another carrier launches, another carrier launches. They're all going in different directions. In fact, the Hornets group, led by a guy called Stanhope Ring, Commander Stanhope Ring, not a particularly good commander, he flies off completely in the wrong direction. And he's got a group of torpedo bombers under a guy named Waldron, and Waldron knows in his head that we're going the wrong way. And Waldron, against orders, breaks off, and Torpedo 8 goes and makes a beeline for the Japanese carriers and actually get there before any other U.S. forces get there. Well, of course, they don't have any escorts. They don't have any fighter planes with them, and they're mauled. Every single plane of Torpedo 8 is destroyed. There's only one survivor from the entire squadron. And it's said by many that Torpedo 8 brought the Japanese combat air patrol down to a really low level, and that's why later on our dive bombers were successful. Unfortunately, that's not true. Torpedo 8 arrived almost an hour before the dive bombers arrived. So consequently, they did add to the battle. They did keep the Japanese busy, but they did not bring the combat air patrol down to that level. That's not true. But Ring, who's flown off in the wrong direction, never finds Kido Butai. His planes basically start running out of gas, and virtually every one of his fighters goes into the water, and many of those people aren't recovered. So basically, Ring loses almost all the fighters from his strike group, and quite honestly, he's never in charge of a combat group after the Battle of Midway again. Not a particularly great effort. Well, 30 SPDs from the Enterprise have missed Kido Butai to the south. They went south, okay? But Commander Wade McCluskey, and McCluskey is an interesting character. He's actually a fighter pilot that has just been transferred to dive bombers. And he sees a destroyer. And this destroyer, Japanese destroyer, is making a beeline north. And he thinks to himself, well, if he's going north, maybe we ought to go north. And that's what he does. And the reason the destroyer is down there was hunting a U.S. sub, keeping it away from Kido Butai. So anyway, he starts going north, and lo and behold, there's Kido Butai directly ahead of him. At the same time, 17 Yorktown SBDs, Douglas Dauntlesses, are coming in from the northeast. One from the south, one from the northeast. Well, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol has been constantly fighting these groups now for a couple of hours. They're landing and taking off. They're starting to get exhausted. They're out of position. Remember, they don't have radar. And consequently, the cap is not nearly as effective as it needs to be. So McCluskey, again, he just started becoming a dive bomber leader, miscommunicates to his group, and all 30 of his dive bombers are going to attack one aircraft carrier, which is the Kaga. Well, one of the pilots, Lieutenant Dick Best, sees this and says, whoa, wait a minute, this is a bad idea. What we need to do is we shouldn't all attack one ship. So he takes himself and his two wingmen, and he, on his own accord, launches an attack on the Akagi. He hits the Akagi with 1,000-pound bomb. One. In the meantime, Kaga is hit by at least 5 bombs from the other planes. So Kaga's toast. So the bomb from Best hits probably, it's kind of like the Arizona. It hits possibly the worst possible place it could hit for the Japanese. And it penetrates that flight deck and blows up amongst all those fueled and armed aircraft in the Japanese hangar deck. Well, it starts a gigantic conflagration, and ordnance starts cooking off, and guess what? Now the Kaga is toast. Then they score, the people from the Yorktown, they score 3 hits. You can see them here in this picture on the Soryu. The Soryu, same issue. The hangar decks are full of planes. Those planes are armed. Those planes have ordnance that's been improperly stored, laying around on the ground. Fuel is leaking everywhere in these enclosed boxes they're in. And quite honestly, those people in those hangar decks have no chance. They take terrible casualties. But the Hiryu escapes. The Hiryu is under clouds, and the U.S. forces don't see it. So consequently, the Hiryu at 11 o'clock launches a strike of 18 valves and 6 zeros, and they're going after the U.S. fleet. But the commander of the Hiryu makes a critical error. He decides to charge after his planes going closer to the U.S. fleet. What he should have done was he should have reversed course, because Japanese planes, as I've said numerous times, have much longer range than U.S. aircraft. So consequently, he still could have recovered his strike and gotten his carrier further away from our carriers and perhaps survived. Unfortunately, he doesn't do that. So those little group of valves we just saw, they scored 3 hits on the Yorktown, but the Yorktown has tremendous damage control. Remember, it's already been damaged previously. It's not fully repaired. They get the thing back up and running and up to 18 knots. 13:30, Hiryu launches a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 zeros. Again, this is all they've got left. And they score 2 torpedo hits out of 10 planes. It's pretty amazing. And the Yorktown just refuses to die. So the Yorktown is abandoned because they think it's going to roll over, but the next day it's still floating. So they decide to take a damage control crew. They ask for volunteers, and they have to go from ship to ship to collect the right people, and they put them back on the Yorktown. On the 6th of June, a Japanese submarine locates the heavily damaged Yorktown, which is starting to be towed back to Pearl Harbor, fires a spread of torpedoes, hits it with 2 more torpedoes, and also there's a destroyer next to it assisting the recovery of the ship, and the Hammond breaks in 2 from a Japanese torpedo hit. So now you think about this. This ship has been hit by 4 torpedoes and 3 bombs, and it still doesn't sink until the very next day on June 7th. Pretty incredibly well-built ship. So back to June 4th, the Hiryu is located. 24 of those Dauntlesses find it. They score 4 hits on the Hiryu, and the Japanese fleet is destroyed. Kido Butai, in this formation, is no longer. Of course, they still have the other 2 carriers, but these 4 carriers are gone. You can see here, this is actually a Japanese picture, and it's a little hard to see this clearly, but the whole front of the ship flight deck is gone. It's totally gone. And when you see a close-up of this, that is actually the forward elevator that has been blown out of the ship and thrown against the island. That's how badly damaged the ship is. So what are the losses? It's unquestionably a U.S. victory. But we lost a fleet carrier and a destroyer, 150 aircraft, and we have 307 dead. The Japanese have lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 cruiser heavily damaged. That's later. I'm not going to go into that because it's really not critical to this. But they've lost 248 aircraft and 3,057 killed in action. So it's long been said that this is the end of Japanese air power, naval air power in World War II. That is not the case. The Japanese have only lost 110 total air crew, and only 36 of those were killed aboard ship. The air crews basically get away. They're not, yes, they lose 248 planes, but the air crew, planes are much more replaceable than people. What they do lose, though, is 721 trained mechanics and 690 engineers that are in those enclosed hangar decks. Those people are basically incinerated. And those are people that are very, very difficult for the Japanese to replace. Because unlike the U.S., the Japanese doesn't have kids that grow up fixing dad's Model T, and they don't have a lot of tractors the kids worked on, and they don't have this trained pool of people that know how to handle mechanical equipment. But we do, of course, so we can take losses like this. The Japanese just can't do this. So consequently, The biggest loss, though, is those 4 fleet carriers. And I'll read to you from a book called Shattered Sword. Their loss, meaning the carriers, permanently ruined what had been the most successful weapon system of the war, and hence must be ranked as far and away the most important material loss of the battle. The Japanese can never replace 4 aircraft carriers with their ability to launch ships. They cannot afford to lose this quality of equipment. So the question stands, was the Battle of Midway decisive? Was this a decisive battle? Well, the answer, in my opinion, is it's not really decisive. But what it does do is it creates the fact that the Japanese Navy, at its all-time most powerful, fighting the U.S. Navy at perhaps its weakest point of the war, and the U.S. manages to create parity between the two forces. This changes the dynamic of the war in the Pacific significantly and will become very apparent in the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. So I think that's really the key part of the Battle of Midway. It doesn't change things inevitably, but the fact of the matter is it does make the U.S. equal to the Japanese in the key forces, which is aircraft carriers. All right, I would like to point out this. This picture was taken by my lovely class coordinator at the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, which we attended at Pensacola. This aircraft, as it says here, it was one of 16 dive bombers from VMS B-241. It was launched from Midway Island on the morning of June 4th. It was holed 219 times. It still made it back, and it survives today at the Naval Aviation Museum of Pensacola, Florida. This is the only thing in the world that took part in the Battle of Midway that you can see and touch. There are no ships left from the battle. They're all gone. There are no other planes. There's nothing left from the battle but this aircraft. So you're wondering, how historic is this aircraft? Well, I'm going to tell you. This aircraft was at Pearl Harbor. This aircraft was at Lake Salamaua when it went over the Owen Stanley Mountains and bombed the Japanese. And then it was transferred to the Marine Corps. Why was it transferred to the Marine Corps? Because it was an SBD-2. The Marines got all the junky cast-offs. The Navy had now switched to SBD-3s, which were a little better aircraft. So consequently, the Marines got this SBD-2, and after the Battle of Midway, it was transferred to Training Command, and it went to 2 little aircraft carriers that were in Lake Michigan. Well, consequently, in 1944, a young ensign was having a training flight, and he took off a little tiny aircraft carrier that was in Lake Michigan, and he dumped this puppy into the lake. It sat on the bottom of Lake Michigan until the 1990s, when it was raised, and it now is restored to its full glory at the museum. So once again, if you want to touch an actual relic, see perhaps one of the most historic aircraft in the world, this plane is available to be seen. And when I talk to you about the dive brakes, remember about slowing the airplane down? That's what I've got my hand on. That's this red, red thing. That's what it looked like when it came out of the lake. So that's why that plane survived, because it was in shallow, fresh water, so it didn't rust completely, and it was capable of being restored. Well, with that said, I have 5 minutes for questions. Yes?
At the end of World War II, how many aircraft carriers did we have?
Okay, well, I cannot, all right. The question was, at the end of World War II, how many aircraft carriers do we have? I cannot tell you the exact number of how many we had. I can tell you the exact number of how many we built. 151. Yes?
Remind us again of in what ways your analysis of Midway differs from the traditional and wrong-headed.
Okay, simple enough. the thought process was that the Japanese had this overwhelming fleet of ships and strength, and consequently could easily defeat the U.S. And of course, that, as I've shown you, of what really mattered, which was air power, that was not the case. The other thing, there's numerous things in this regard. One is the thought process that the Japanese had all their planes on deck and they were just seconds away from launching a strike to destroy the U.S. carriers. That's not true. The Japanese, and there's pictures to that effect, the Japanese planes are below deck, waiting to be brought up. So consequently, when they are hit by our bombs, those hangar decks become infernos because it's full of gasoline and ordnance and airplanes. The other huge piece about this that's frequently misconstrued is that, of course, that this was the decisive battle and it totally changed everything in World War II in the Pacific. That's not the case. Between April of 42 and April of 1943, the Japanese, I believe the exact number, lost 2,817 naval aircraft. As you can see here, they only lost 248. So where do they lose most of those aircraft? They lose them in the Solomon Islands. So the Midway battle becomes, again, it's critical because now we're equal to the Japanese. But the fact of the matter is it decisive? No, it's not. It's not decisive at all.
And it was a victory.
It was a huge victory, yeah.
Yeah, no, we were pretty despairing.
Well, yeah, it was, it was a big victory, no question. It was like, but they couldn't really tell everybody because the fact of the matter is we didn't want the Japanese to know we were breaking all their codes. So if we told them everything we know, they would go, how the hell do they know that? Because the Japanese didn't tell their own people. Yes, sir?
How many of the 200-something Japanese aircraft losses were because they didn't have a place to land?
The vast majority. So that's why the pilots survived.
So did the Japanese, from the first three carriers, something, those pilots try to land on the remaining one, or were they just out of luck?
They were pretty much just out of luck because there was no room on the flight decks. The flight decks were continuously busy launching cap fighters. So they just never had time. So the question was what happens to the aircraft that were at Midway? Where did most of these planes get lost? And the fact of the matter is most of those planes landed in the water and their pilots and crews were rescued by Japanese destroyers. So again, the losses of aircrew are actually rather small. They only lost 110 aircrew. Remember, some of those planes have 3 people on them. So it's not like that it was 1-to-1. So consequently, their aircrew, and again, only 36 aircrew are killed on board the carriers by U.S. bombs and fire. So the losses of actual Japanese military personnel that were flyers is actually very low. It's not decisive. Yes?
When the Japanese planes return from an attack, they're going to be refueled and bombed up again. They go into the hangar deck.
Yes.
Okay, so now they're down there, they get all that done, they come back up, and do they have to warm up the engines again?
Yes.
So what is, you say, is the turnaround time with all of that?
It's probably over an hour. So again, once the U.S. forces had been launched at around between 7 and 8 a.m. from our carriers, by the time the Japanese knew where our carriers were, it was too late. So the whole mythos that it was only seconds away from the Japanese launching a strike that would have prevented our strike, that's totally wrong. They had no chance. The Japanese were under way too much pressure. So they never, ever had a chance to do what they needed to do.
Did they ever break radio silence?
Oh, they did once they were under attack. It didn't matter at that point. Yeah. They had to tell Yamamoto things were going poorly. Yes, sir?
How about prisoners?
Yes, there were actually one small group of Japanese were on a little boat, a little, dinghy from the, it was from the Hiryu, I believe. And they were caught like 20 days later, and they were in such bad condition that they couldn't basically put up a fight. Really, they were, you know, dehydrated, etc. As far as the question was about prisoners of war, there were a small group of Japanese prisoners of war. And by the way, their commander on that little dinghy, they wanted to throw him overboard because he thought he's the commander and he deserved more rations and more water than they did. But he survived. The U.S. prisoners, there were several U.S. pilots from the early strikes that were pulled out of the water. They were taken on board, I believe, a Japanese destroyer. They were severely questioned. When they had received the information that they wanted, the Japanese then beheaded them and threw them over the side. And it is time. Thank you so much.